Welcome to The Feminist Romantic. I'm your host, Cara McKinnon. On this special Halloween episode, I'll be examining the unlikely confluence of romance and horror. A note before I begin. Any of the books that I talk about today should make for fun and sometimes terrifying reading as we approach All Hallows Eve. And it may seem odd to have chosen this topic for a podcast that so far has featured science fiction and fantasy and time travel. But I feel that horror and romance actually go really well together. It seems like they should be opposites, but one creates feelings of love and joy and passion in its audience, and the other creates fear. But they are both genres that appeal to the emotions, even if they're opposite emotions. But they're complementary emotions. A good romance will have moments of deep and terrible fear, whether it's for the protagonists, their lives, or their relationship. You're just scared that they're not actually going to get together. And a good horror can also appeal to our feelings of love and passion and joy to counterbalance the moments of fear and terror. Taking readers from the heights of romantic euphoria to the depths of human and inhuman depravity is quite a skill, however. And so it's rare to find a really good author who can do both at the same time. So it's somewhat of a niche genre to do actual horror romance. It's extremely common to find romantic elements in horror books and horrific elements in romance books, but a true horror romance crossover is definitely niche. There aren't that many writers who are actually doing it. Part of the problem is just that it is so difficult to do and do well. Another part of the problem is that most horror readers I've met would shudder at picking up a romance book, probably because they've never read one. And if they actually read one, they might be pleasantly surprised. The negative stigma about romance is pervasive, and I fight against it every day. But romance readers, on the other hand, tend to be a little more intrepid, will read anything. All of the readers that I've ever met tell me they get bored if they just read one genre all the time. They like to pick up new things. And if you're a reader who prefers your one genre, that's great too. Keep reading. If that's what makes you happy, fantastic. But it's good to experiment. It's good to try new things every once in a while. See if you like that other genre that you've been hearing so much about. You could surprise yourself. In any case, getting back to the topic, most readers that I have met who love romance are broad readers. They love everything. I found that I love suspense. I don't so much like splatter and gore, especially gratuitous splatter and gore. But I also, don't tell anyone, I don't like gratuitous sex in books either. I know that sounds difficult to believe. I write a lot of sex in my books, but I work really hard at making sure that the sex is part of the story and tells us something about the characters, creates new conflicts and problems for them, and it's not just there to titillate my reader. So I don't like gratuitous anything in a book, whether it's sex or splatter. So I'm not a fan of the genres where there's just blood everywhere, or I suppose I should say horror movies. So you don't get so much of that in horror books, but definitely not horror movies where it's just like gross all the time. I can't. I just don't know. But suspense now, like psychological horror, I love that. I also hate that, but I love that. I love to be scared. I have read a lot of authors who I feel do this well, from, of course, Stephen King. If you've read a horror book, you've read Stephen King. But I also like Shirley Jackson, Jonathan Mayberry, Richard Matheson, and of course our, genre grandfather and grandmother, Bram Stoker and Mary Shelley. Although you could argue that Frankenstein is more science fiction, but I would say that it's definitely pushing a lot of boundaries into what we consider horror as well. So I also enjoy it very much when I find a romance author who can bring dark, gritty madness into their romance book and still have it end with happy ever after. Now, today's podcast isn't so much of an analysis per se, although I do talk a little bit about how the books work and why I think that they are horror as well as romance. But it's more of an exploration through books that I have read and others that I think are worth mentioning as famous examples of this type of book. So the one that I think is worth mentioning, but I have not read, or I've only read part of, is the elephant in the room of the horror romance genre, which is Stephenie Meyer's Twilight series. Now, I can hear the horror fans saying Twilight is not horror. Well, I didn't read the whole thing. I did read the first 2 books, but I know lots of people who have read the whole thing. And from their descriptions of certain things that happen later in the series, oh my gosh, yes, that's horror. For those of you who have read the books, I understand that the birthing scene is one of the goriest and most horrific things ever to be put onto paper. So yes, her vampires sparkle, but she did not shy away from some of the gorier and scarier elements of the vampire and werewolf stories that she was bringing into her romance. So Meyer exists, she's out there, and thanks to her, there is a huge market now for vampire and werewolf books, or shifter books, in romance that maybe wasn't there before, certainly not since the ebook explosions. If you go and look right now at Paranormal Romance on the Amazon Kindle page, you're going to see lots of shifter books and lots of vampire books. And it's because of Stephenie Meyer. So I have to mention her. You may love her, you may hate her. I did try to read the whole series. I couldn't make it through for a couple of reasons. Most of them have been widely covered elsewhere on the internet, having to do with Edward and stalking and manipulation and stuff like that. And also having a little bit to do with her writing, which is not the best. It's not terrible, but it's not the best. So I couldn't make it through, but you might love it. A lot of people do. So if you haven't read those yet, it's worth a try at least. Pick up Twilight. If you love it, you love it. If you hate it, you probably hate it. There's not a whole lot of in between on that series. But as much as I dislike the way that Meyer crafted her romance, it is clearly a romance series. Bella and Edward are star-crossed lovers who finally get a happy ending at the end. And so for that reason, it's mentioned here. I will not, however, be mentioning some other very big and popular vampire series like Anne Rice, because all of the Anne Rice books have romantic entanglements in them and certain love stories and hate stories. There's no true romance arc as we understand it in the romance genre. So I'm only going to be talking about romances today that bring in horror elements, and definitely Twilight is one of those. I will also not be talking just about paranormal romance books. The ones I was just talking about that have vampires and shifters as characters, because just because you have an element from that horror genre doesn't make it a horror romance crossover. In my opinion, at least, the way I'm defining a horror romance crossover for today's episode is that the author not only has to pull from horror with tropes and characters and things like that, but they have to actually set out to terrify or sometimes disgust their reader with those elements. So having a vampire as one of your main characters doesn't make it a horror romance. Having a vampire who does terrifying things or is involved in terrifying things, and then who then, gets pulled back from it, and who your reader is possibly even terrified of until they fall in love and change their ways. That would be a horror romance. But in general, I'm not going to talk about the run-of-the-mill average paranormal romance. What I will be talking about is what some people consider dark paranormal. So yes, the stories that seek to actually terrify and frighten their readers. The first series of this type that I ever encountered is one by Nora Roberts called The Sine of Seven. That is not a vampire story. It is a demon story. And honestly, it's probably not that scary if you have read a lot of horror, which I hadn't at the time. But the scariest thing for me was reading a section and hearing a description of a particular road that one of the heroines is driving on and realizing it was my road. So, yeah, Nora Roberts lives near me, and she writes a lot of her, or she sets a lot of her series in the area where we both live. So it was a little bit scary to look up from my book and out my window and say, that's my road. That's where I live. This is all happening where I live, even though obviously it's not really happening where I live, or wasn't, and will never. It's all fiction. But when you're in the moment of the book and you have that visceral reaction, you're not telling yourself, oh, this isn't real, it doesn't matter. You're like, oh crap, that's right outside my door. So there will always be a special place in my heart for that particular series for giving me that scare moment. So the Sine of Seven series, aside from obviously having to do with demons, also definitely sets out to scare the reader. Again, probably not as well as a true horror book, but she uses a lot of familiar horror elements, like the demonic child, who is made creepier because they're supposed to look innocent, but yet there's like glowing creepy eyes or whatever. It also deals with the psychological trauma of being part of a demonic bloodline and knowing that the horrors that are being perpetrated in the story are responsible or are created by a being that's responsible for some of the characters even being alive. So there's a lot of stuff going on in that book, that book series, in addition to the romances, that is clearly terrifying and clearly meant to frighten the reader. So I mention them here. In a different vein, still fantastic, of course, are the series of Simon Feximel short stories by K.J. Charles. This series includes a scorching gay romance, atmospheric and gothic horror, and the supernatural, and late Victorian era historical details. So Simon and Robert are a paranormal and gay variation of Holmes and Watson, and Charles even does a little homage to Conan Doyle by creating a character that's only known as the Fat Man, but in her author's note she says it's supposed to be Mycroft Holmes. But these stories are a much darker and more visceral type than Conan Doyle, pulling more from the gothic and supernatural stories of the period, the Penny Dreadful type of story. She definitely brings in horrific elements. The first story in the series that she has put together as the Secret Casebook of Simon Feximel is a haunting story. It's not really that scary, but moving through the books or the stories, you get, people being killed by butterflies, you get a rat story, all kinds of interesting things, people being flayed alive and their skins being turned into a door. So yeah, it's kind of scary and gross and things that I wouldn't have necessarily picked for my romance, but she did, and she makes it work. And it was through Simon Feximel that I discovered the Wyborn and Griffin series, because they did a crossover story between Wyborn and Griffin and Simon and Robert. I haven't actually read that story yet. It's on my TBR pile. But because of that, I picked up the first of the Wyborn and Griffin books, and I mentioned that on my last podcast as I'm really enjoying the series so far. But that series also brings in, I guess what I would call the literary equivalent of jump scares, in addition to psychological elements and some mild gore. But at the same time, it also develops a romantic relationship between the eponymous protagonists, in between dealing with reincarnated mages and beings from another dimension and all other sorts of horrific elements, which creates this roller coaster ride of emotions for the characters and, by extension, for the reader. So that's one of the things that I find most fun about this type of book. It's something that romantic suspense also does, but does it by channeling the more mystery, action-adventure kind of genre in addition to the romance, bringing in different elements to allow for a swing of emotions. And another one that does it well is, again, going back to KJ Charles, her actual novel series called A Charm of Magpies, that begins with The Magpie Lord, is another one. There are elements from the main character, Lord Crane's family, being used in death to create a powerful magical spell, and it requires, the use of their dead bodies, which is sort of gross, and the things that were being done to his family, making them kill themselves, and it's a whole lot of these really dark elements. And then later in the series, again with the rats, I don't know, I think she has something about rats. There's another story that deals with giant rats and attacking people, and So it just in general, she brings in a lot of, I guess, really good tension and elements that can turn my stomach at least, and then segues into these really hot sex scenes. And not just gratuitous hot sex, but actually character building sex scenes that show us important things that are happening in the characters' lives. So she's really a master at bringing together the horror elements with the romance and creating this beautiful blend that just makes you sit on the edge of your seat and then be really turned on a few seconds later. I've seen recently that she released a pure horror story that was previously published in an anthology that's called The Price of Meat. It uses the demon barber of Fleet Street legend as its jumping off place. But she says that, she couldn't resist also having a little bit of romance in there as well. So I haven't picked that one up yet, but I think I might try to read that tomorrow for Halloween. So that should be fun. Also on my horror crossover list is Laurel Key Hamilton, although I put her on here with a caveat because I'm here celebrating what I consider to be horror romance, and oddly, her Anita Blake series started as pure paranormal mystery, or more like urban fantasy mystery, and it shifted over time, first to paranormal romance, then to erotic romance, then to extremely erotic romance, and the last book I read in that series is basically pure erotica. And I like erotica when that's what I want to read. But I mentioned already, I don't like gratuitous sex scenes in my stories because it distracts me from the story. So I think her books have suffered for the amount of sex that is in there because it doesn't tell me anything about the characters. And this author, Hamilton, used to write really engrossing stories with complex, interesting characters. So it's really a disappointment to pick up this book expecting one thing and get something else. So, I don't know. If you are interested in the romance horror crossover, the first several books, like I said, are not so much romance and more paranormal, horror, urban fantasy, mystery. And then once you get a few books in, you start getting more of the romance elements. And at some point, like me, you'll probably drop off because it stops being about the story. But it's definitely worth reading the first several books. And if you find that you like the sex part of it, you can try the Mary Gentry books. The first books in that series are still definitely very erotic romance, but they are romance, at least in the beginning. And then that one kind of falls off the deep end, and from what I've read about them, I think she may finally have kind of settled into the romance later, but at least in the middle, it was basically just picking up a book of paranormal erotica. So if you like that sort of thing, and again, I do, depending, but it was just a disappointment for me because I really enjoy her character work, and it was disappointing not to get that. But she also brings in a lot of elements of horror. In the Mary Gentry series, it's a lot of fairy type of horror, but there's a lot of really dark things that happen in that series. Her main character, Mary Gentry, is a member of the Dark Fairy Court, so lots of really, I guess, horrific and terrifying things happen. In the Anita Blake series, Anita Blake is someone who can talk to the dead, and so obviously just from that you have, the elements of as much horror as you want, and then she gets involved with shifters and vampires and lots of other things, and yeah, snowball effect. But so they're still very good representations of what I'm calling the horror/romance genre. They just then fall over into the horror erotica genre. Is that a thing? I guess it is a thing. It's what Laurel Key Hamilton is writing now. All right, I could probably keep going for ages and ages, but I'm going to finish out this podcast with one final recommendation, and then I hope you'll give me some recommendations in the comments. This last recommendation isn't entirely horror, or entirely fantasy, or entirely romance, but lives in a kind of weird world in between. It's a much more true genre mesh than most of the other ones that I've mentioned, which you could say, for the most part, that all the ones I've said so far, other than maybe the Anita Blake and Mary Gentry books, are clearly romances at heart that have brought heavy horror elements into them to make their crossover. But at their base, they're really romances. And this last one isn't really any one thing. It's a lot of things at the same time. And that book is Sunshine by Robin McKinley. Robin McKinley is known for her fantasy stories, but they always include at least some element of romance. And for that reason, they stole my heart when I was in middle school. And I have fallen in love with her, and I'm very saddened that she hasn't written a lot lately, but she has a lot of things going on in her life. But without a doubt, my favorite book of hers is Sunshine. Sunshine is written in first person from the perspective of Ray Seddon, whose stepfather calls her Sunshine. So we're in her POV for the whole book. It's written in an alternate Earth where things are a little different than they are here. The supernatural is known and hostile for the most part to humans, but there are also supernatural types living among the humans very quietly, some of whom are known to the populace, and kind of keep their supernaturalness quiet. Some of them are mages, and they tend to be powerful and rich. And there are also vampires. Things go wrong for Sunshine when she encounters vampires for the first time. And I'm going to leave it at that and just say that the way that McKinley writes a vampire story is different and refreshing and beautiful and lyrical and amazing. And if you pick this book up, know that you're going to have to go through a pretty good chunk of not a lot of things happening at the beginning of it. But when things start to happen, you're going to get sucked in. And so push through the beginning. Once you get to the vampires, you're not going to want to put the book down again until you're done. So I highly, highly recommend it. And then when you're done, accept the fact that there is not going to be a sequel. It's one of McKinley's hated questions. It's like the number one thing in her FAQs on her website. No, there is not a sequel to Sunshine, and there's not going to be a sequel to Sunshine. So just internalize that before you get started. Come up with fan fiction in your head afterward. I know I have. But it's still very, very worth the read and is my number one recommendation for if you are trying to think of what book am I going to read tomorrow for Halloween. Pick up Sunshine. It's out on ebook as well as in paperback. It is amazing and transformative, and you should definitely read it. It's one of those rare books that leaves you both deeply satisfied with the way the story arced and ended, and yet yearning for more. Yearning for more. Forever. But it's worth it, really. I swear, it's really worth it. So that's all for today. In 2 weeks, I will have an episode about NaNoWriMo, or National Novel Writing Month, because that's what I will be doing for the month of November, trying to finish the next book in my series. It's supposed to be out in December. Oh my, I have my work cut out for me. Until then, if you have any recommendations for horror romance crossovers, please email me, thefeministromantic@gmail.com. I'll post them on my website. Or you can go right to the website, thefeministromantic.com, and leave a comment on the blog post for this episode. I appreciate hearing from listeners and would love to chat with you about what you like, love, hate about horror romance. And until next time, I'm Cara McKinnon, and thanks for listening.